I'm going to do a short introduction with some acknowledgements and practical things, so bear with them, and then we'll get started with Eliza. So to start with my thanks and acknowledgements, thank you to the Lithuanian Council for Culture and the Creative Europe program of the European Union, which has funded a 2-year creative project called Who Cares, and which has supported this program this year and this particular talk. I'm grateful to the fund and to the other partners in the program, which are Space UK, Identitat, Grey Area, Centro Huarte, and I would also like to thank my colleagues at Rupert, and especially Simona Sunita, who is here in the corner under Rupert. So Simona is currently interning at Rupert. It comes from a background in economics, but is working really hard with us and doing some really great work on the public programs. And we have her to thank for bringing this whole Zoom together and coordinating it so well. So thank you, Simona. I would also like to thank Chuck Hayes, who has done the live captioning for our talks in the past, and it is doing the live captioning right now. And Jack Cinnamon, who will do the live transcriptions for the breakout sessions. And thank you, Jack, for joining, especially so last minute and on a Friday night. I want to make sure that we are attentive to the capacities of Simona, Chuck, and Jack. So please be patient if there are any little delays or little errors. They're working really, really hard. And Chuck will also let me know if they need a break, in which case we'll just pause it, the talk briefly. So a brief note on Zoom etiquette. I'm sure you all know this, but for those who might not, if you can raise your hand that either physically, if you're able to, or use the little icon if you wish to speak, that would be great. And we ask that only one person speaks at a time. And if you can mute yourself, which I see you have all already done, when you're not speaking, that would be great. If you want to leave your camera off, that is completely fine, of course. And if you need to have a break or check out, also completely fine. You can use the chat function, which is at the bottom. So if you have any questions, queries, concerns, comments, and myself and Simona will do our best to make sure that we keep on top of them. So for the breakout rooms, Eliza and I will go through this again, but just briefly here. So for those of you who require live captioning or transcriptions, we have 2 options for the breakout rooms. So one will have the live captions by Chuck, and the other will have the conversation transcribed in a Google Doc by Jack Cinnamon, to which you will be granted access. The reason for this is because Zoom only allows one live captioner for one breakout session. So we have to use this slightly inventive way around it. So if you have a preference for one or the other, please let us know, and we'll assign you to the breakout session, breakout room that is best for you. So we will record this event, but not the breakout sessions. And the recording is for our purposes. We might publish the talk itself by Eliza on our YouTube page, but we will do that with consent, particularly if there is any discussion. So that's, if you do not wish for it to be recorded or disseminated, then please do let us know. This goes perhaps without saying, but we're all here committed to non-discrimination, and this is important that this space is full of trust and care. So please keep this a welcoming online environment, and support each other in this discussion and interactive talk. So now to the meat of the introduction about Eliza, and then we'll get started. So Eliza Chandler is speaking as part of Rupert's current programs, which are exploring, and I would say, and I hope, are practicing interdependence and care. We've had many brilliant speakers, one of whom, David, is here, I see, and I think we might have a couple of others. And in the upcoming weeks, we're going to have many great workshops and talks. They will all be announced on our website and on our social media. Please do join. It will be a real pleasure to see both the same faces and names and new ones too. The past talks will be available to watch online in the upcoming weeks on our YouTube page, and we'll also be launching a journal with contributions from our past speakers and invited guests. I'm really excited Eliza agreed to talk as part of these programs. We've been chatting since spring, I think, and it's really nice that after some issues that were provoked by the pandemic, we can make sure that we're welcoming Eliza to give this talk and workshop in this time. One of the reasons I'm very grateful Eliza is speaking is because I think I personally, and I know many others, have learnt a lot from Eliza's practice about thinking about access in a thoroughgoing way. It's important for me, and I believe for the whole team as well, that we are committed to access and really thinking about accessibility in broad and intimate terms. And I would like to emphasize what Eliza and Mia Mingus have said about access, that it is a liberatory tool, and that the reason we work for access is for the sake of connection, and here I'm quoting Mia, justice, community, love, and liberation. And indeed, the whole reason this program came into being was because of the intimate conversations I and others have had with people like David Rubain here, our residents like Leah Clements, my colleagues, and many others. And I would like that this program continues to be shaped by, to quote Eliza, living and loving interdependently. So to that end, it's hugely important that this event is a process of learning and listening. And so please do let us know if there are ways in which we can improve or develop or transform. That would be really important. You will have read Eliza's brilliant bio, so I'm going to not read out the whole thing here, but just in short. So Eliza earned her PhD from the Social Justice and Education Department at the University of Toronto in 2014, and she was duly appointed the Artistic Director at Tangled Art Plus Disability, an organization in Toronto dedicated to the cultivation of disability arts, and the postdoctoral research fellow in Ryerson University School of Disability Studies from 2014 to 2016. She was also the founding artistic director of Tangled Art Gallery, Canada's first art gallery dedicated to showcasing disability art and advancing accessible curatorial practice. Chandler is currently assistant professor in the School of Disability Studies at Ryerson University. She's the co-director of a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council funded partnership project, Bodies in Translation, Activist Art, Technology and Access to Life, which I believe we will be also looking at in the course of this talk. Many accolades to Eliza's name, but I know we're here to listen and discuss together. So over to you, Eliza, and really looking forward to this talk and workshop. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Yates. That was a generous introduction, and I really do want to begin by thanking you and Simona for all of your support and advertisement of this event. And thank you all for coming. It's about noon on Friday here, so it's the middle of a work day, but I know it's Friday night for you all, so I really appreciate you coming. So I think Yates did a nice job of doing a bit of an access check-in. I'll say that I will provide visual descriptions of the slides, and thanks to the live captioners for your support. Are there any other things that we should be attending to in terms of access before getting going? I think in terms of what I can offer for myself is I'll try to keep on times. So I might ask for help with time checks. I think Yates will do that for me. So I'll describe what I'm planning on doing, but who knows what will happen. So I'm really flex, and I'm happy to share the entire talk with all of you. But also acknowledge that it's quite a long talk, so we might not get through it all, and I think we can prioritize group conversation in this talk. So without further ado, I think I'll get started. And I'll share my screen with you here. I also have my eye on the chat, so feel free to chat if I need to slow down, or I'm a pretty slow talker, so I doubt that will be an issue, but anything at all, just let me know. Okay, so I'll click forward to the second slide. And this is a slide of Tarek Amtalaki, a performer from Brownton Abbey, and disability arts group in northern UK at Manchester. On the screen, Tarek, a brown person who's wearing goggles, a headpiece out of 2 green pom-poms in neon clothing, and they stand with their arm outstretched and raised, holding a group of balloons. So my talk today will take up access as it is practiced in arts and cultural institutions as a political project. One that I think, and I'll suggest throughout the talk, can ultimately help us rework the institutions we find ourselves in order to make them more hospitable to us and the communities we work in. I will begin by briefly introducing how I conceptualize and practice access within my own work. At that point, we'll have a bit of a group discussion on how you all think about access and practice it within your work. Following this, I'll give a few more examples about how I think access practices can help us rework the space we find ourselves in. And at this point, we'll check in with the group and maybe take a short break. But after we come back, I'll share some very recent work in progress work, which attempts to think about how we can use access as provoking an intervention by becoming what Wen Yang calls cyborgs, a term I'll introduce. I'll end my talk with some more small group work in which we will apply some of the ways we've begun to think about access to access scenarios that may come up in our work. I've prepared some of these scenarios based on my own work, and you might also have your own access quandaries that you would like to add to the mix. So does this sound okay? Is the way to get started? Okay, great. So I want to begin with a few quotes that help me frame the way that I approach my work in general. So Mingus says that disabled people don't want to join the ranks of the privileged. We want to dismantle these ranks and the systems that maintain them. Similarly, Kelly Fritz frames crip as an opening up with desire for the ways that disability disrupts. So taken together, these two goals are instrumental to how to my curatorial practice, for the way that they move us away from projects of inclusion into a cultural space that oppresses many of us, and instead takes the disruption that disability makes as an opportunity to break from the system in order to transform into something new. This is fundamental to how I understand disability arts and curating disability arts as a distinctly anti-assimilationist political project that's focused on reworlding. So building new worlds in which we as disabled people can be as we are. So the first sort of thing that I want to talk about is conceptualizing access. And here on the screen is an image by Sandy Yee. So we see Yee standing in the background of this photograph wearing custard-colored shorts. In the foreground, the two fingers on Yee's hand are stretched apart with a white gel stitched to a custard-colored yellow triangle between them. So this way of approaching disability arts also informs how I take up access in my practice, not simply as a set of logistics, but as an opportunity to think about and change the ways we interact with art and the institutions wherein we most often encounter it. Access can be taken up as a political project when it's not focused on inclusion, but reworking our spatial interactions. My approach to access is largely informed by disability artist Carmen Papalia's open access framework, which tells us we must not approach access through a checkbox of best practices as a set of standardized and unchanging logistics to which we can perfectly comply and never have to revisit. This checkbox approach takes up access as not only a set of logistics, but it complies to a minimum standard of accessibility, which is a preferred approach to access under neoliberalism, as it follows a one-size-fits-all solution, which makes economic sense. Building a ramp might only seem costly when it's building a ramp might seem costly when it's only for disabled people, but when we widen the users of this ramp to include people pushing strollers and dollies, then the ramp becomes for everyone, thus increasing the cost effectiveness of access. Moreover, this approach often allows disabled people, but only some disabled people, access into a normative culture, and that normative culture often oppresses lots of us, and it leaves that culture undisrupted. So to return to the ramp analogy, as long as the building has a ramp, we don't need to worry about the oppressive culture that lives within. So as I suggest throughout this talk, we need to be critical of this kind of inclusion. The next slide features a group of protesters wearing light blue ADA Now t-shirts, and they're crawling up the steps of an inaccessible legislative building in San Francisco. The photograph centers on a young white girl who is crawling up the steps. So Amy Hamraie offers us a notion of critical access in their book, Building Access, Universal Design, and the Politics of Disability. This is a good framework through which we can be critical of acts of accessibility that holds inclusion as a thing goal. Access, as Hamraie writes, is political work. They historicize this claim by asserting that in the early days of disability rights struggles for access, activists use acts of civil disobedience. They would park their wheelchairs in front of buses and things like this. This was a disruptive movement with an anti-assimilationist agenda and tactics, one that centered disability experiences in politics, and it led to major legislative changes. So passages of all kinds of accessibility legislations. But since the passage of these acts, which again were motivated by disabled people who were not interested in conforming but building something new, since the passage of these acts, accessibility has become subsumed under a neoliberal agenda and mobilized through the universal design maxim. Accessible design is good for everyone. So again, the RAP only becomes valuable when it's recognized for its potential to bring more people in, ideally more consumers in. So the trouble with this is that the neoliberal conception of the all, particularly when it comes to design, rarely includes disabled people. And therefore we've become written out of the accessibility plans that were intended for us. On the screen is a still from Aslan Thompson's film Three Windows, and we see an open window loosely covered by a white sheer piece of fabric. So as a curator in disability arts in a country, Canada, that supports disability arts in terms of funding, I often see programmers and curators take up disability cultural practices of accessibility that follow this idea of good access is better for everyone. And what I think happens in these instances is that unintentionally disabled people get sidelined. So an interesting example of this is relaxed performances. And I believe Yates or Simona was sending around a bit of information about relaxed performances. So these are performances which were started by disability activists in the UK, and Just Tom, Tourette's Hero in particular, where they relaxed the conventions of theater. So you could go in and make noise and sit on the floor and sort of be disruptive in the ways that you needed to be. The lights were sort of softened, and particularly the actors and the directors would announce if there were any sort of startling events happening within the play, so that you could prepare yourself or leave the space when you felt like you needed to. So this is a great example of how arts practices, curatorial practices, can be motivated by the disruption that disabled people make. So to return to Fritz's quote, to center and to desire that disruption as creating a new kind of space rather than trying to stifle that disruption. And relaxed performances have been taken up quite a bit all over Canada, thanks in part to a series of workshops funded by the British Council here. But what I see happening is people are really excited about the potential of relaxed performances, and they become advertised as a place where you can take your kids. They happen early in the morning, stuff like this. You know, everybody is welcome. And what happens is that often within these relaxed performances, they offer a PG version of the play, stuff like this, right? So that's evidence that not only is it not centering the disabled people for whom that performance was intended, and actually sort of prioritizing the children in the room, but one that becomes the only opportunity for disabled people to attend to play, and perhaps they don't want to see a PG version, then what happens is their needs get sidelined. So I want to pause at this point, and have a bit of a discussion about how you might all think about access and practice access in your work. So as we do, I'd like for us to think about access broadly conceived, but in a way that still centers disabled people and disability rights and justice. So we can acknowledge that disabled people live intersectional lives. So what counts as access, still centering disabled people, might extend beyond just confronting physical barriers. So for instance, an all-gender washroom may be a point of access that does not necessarily focus on physical barriers, but still centers disabled people, given that disabled people are also trans and gender fluid, etc. It always takes a second to arrange the screen. So the next slide up here now is Shannon Finnegan's installation called Benches. And you see a simple white blue bench sitting in a gallery, and inscribed on the back of the bench are the words, "This exhibition has asked me to sit for too long." And on the seat it says, "Sit if you agree." So you can imagine these benches installed through gallery spaces, which they are. And I think these are just such interesting examples. So Shannon is an artist herself, and when she's asked to exhibit her work in galleries, she often exhibits these benches, which is a really interesting way to sort of have her own access needs met, and do so through the creation of art. And I think with sort of these very didactic inscriptions, she's inviting people to think about the normative expectations that are often circulating within galleries. The gallery is asking us to stand, and if the gallery is not providing benches, it is requiring us to stand. And for some of us, myself included, it's for too long. So I think these are interesting examples of motivating access as a creative endeavor, one that centralizes disabled people's experiences. And I would be really interested to know what happens after her exhibition is over. So if you can imagine, for the duration of her exhibition, there are these benches and the gallery suddenly becomes accessible to her. And what is the process of sort of deinstalling and in fact returning your gallery space to its former less accessible self, I guess. So here on the screen is another example of sort of this way that access can be motivated by an experience. So this is artwork by Persimmon Blackbridge, and these are sort of smallish Barbie doll type scale sculptures that are made up of different kinds of wood, sticks and bones and feathers, to create sort of asymmetrical but beautiful bodies. And I think these are such beautiful examples of disability aesthetics, because the aesthetics of the work are really motivated by sort of this disruptive body, this sort of body that's held together by human-made and natural-made materials. If you see the image on the top right-hand corner, this particular image really resonated with me, because her body sort of twists and her arm or what I read as an arm is tightly bound behind her back, which is actually how I'm sitting right now. So to see this work, to see a representation of one's own body in a gallery as something that derives its beauty or its aesthetics through its difference, and I think it's a really powerful thing. So this exhibition, when it was installed at the Tangled Art Gallery, it was our first exhibition, so we were very sort of careful to get everything right. And one way to make artwork accessible for people is to make it tactile, to allow people to touch it. In my small group, we were talking about the process of creating audio description for artwork, which is always mediated by somebody else's interpretation of the work, and which gets fed into the description as it is read out. So a more immediate way to experience this work for a blind person, for example, would be to touch it. So we asked Persimmon, the artist, can people touch your work? And she said, no, it's too fragile and it will break, which is a perfectly sort of fine response for an artist to give. So then we were trying to brainstorm, well, how can we make this work accessible through touch? So we offered, we could do something like have a 3D printout and silicone of one of these images or something like that. How could we do that? And she came back and said, you know what, let me try to make one of these sculptures that is touchable. And that's what she did. And the sculpture that she presented to us was, on the one hand, a more sturdy version of these sculptures. You could touch it and it wouldn't break. But I think even more interesting than that was that when she made that work, she tried to think about touch as the intended way to experience the sculpture. So instead of, as you typically might do, sort of look at the sculpture and assess whether it was done, whether it was balanced, whether the form made sense to her through her own sight, she actually challenged herself to touch the work and assess the work through her own tactile experience of it. So what she presented to us was something that was really intended to be experienced through touch. So I think this is a sort of, to go back to what David was talking about before, this is such an interesting response to the demand for access, because the demand for access actually produces more art, which is a distinctly different response than the production of, a push button or a ramp, which are important. But I think this is a really interesting example that centralizes, again, disabled people. So I'm going to go a little bit and then have a time check, but just sort of a little bit more. So here on the screen is a work by Papalia, who I spoke about before, and he identifies as a non-visual artist, or in another sense, a blind artist. And here he is leading a group of sighted people down the steps of a gallery. So, and each person has their hands on the person in front of them's shoulders. And so it's interesting to think about the experience of blindness as often being portrayed as disorienting or even sort of dangerous in public space, where instead Carmen is sort of leading the tour. So he repositions himself as someone who is oriented in the space. So Carmen Papalia offers us an open access framework, which informs much of how I approach access in my own work. So he encourages us to think about access from an iterative and not knowing stance that again centralizes disability, acknowledging that everyone carries a body of local knowledge and is an expert in their own right. So access, open access, as you said, is an assemblage that is co-designed by people who will be in the room, who might be in the room, who have been in the room, and who we hope might feel invited to come into the room. So this is sort of a much different approach than just sort of thinking about access without involving disabled people, but sort of co-designing access depending on who's in the room. And this relates also, I think, to me and Mingus's concept of access intimacy, wherein she describes access intimacy as not just the action of access or helping someone. She says we've all experienced access that has left us feeling like a burden, violated, or just plain shitty, she says. Instead, access intimacy is that elusive, hard to describe feeling when someone just gets your access need, the kind of eerie comfort that your disabled self feels with someone on a purely access level. She says sometimes it can happen with complete strangers, disabled or not, or sometimes it can be built up over years. She describes it could also be the way that your body relaxes and opens up with someone when all of your access needs are met. This is describing a really felt experience of access, which, you know, like every kind of access, we can't force access intimacy. We can't demand that we are, you know, intimately acquainted with each other's access needs. But I think what we can do is we can create the conditions for access intimacy to occur within our spaces so that people can relax in their body and not feel like they're a burden and that their access needs are sort of disrupting the space in a way that is undesired. But actually the way that they are in the space is collectively responded to, and the whole space and the feeling in the space shifts. So I think we can create the conditions for this to happen through things like establishing access expectations, which I'll talk about in a second, and co-designing access together through access check-in. So I was going to talk about both of these things in more detail, but I think for the interest of time, I'll just say sort of access guides are one access practice that I've recently started doing in my work, where, and actually I have a photo of one. So here on the screen you see an image from a page of an access guide. So access guides are guides that explain how access is being planned for at an event or an opening or something like that. So you sort of lay out everything that's being planned for, which takes away sort of the hidden labor that many disabled people have to take on when they have to phone ahead to make sure that there's interpretation or attendant care or something like that. Instead, you sort of explicate it. And then in combination with sort of telling people what you planned, in response to Carmen Papalia's suggestion that, you know, we can never know access completely, we invite people to contact us if our access plan has not yet anticipated what they need to access the event. And it's not as though you can always respond to every request. I mean, you're tied with budget and things like this, but it is about sort of managing those expectations so that you give people agency to choose whether or not they come to the event. And you know, for example, if their access need is to eat frequently and they've discovered that there won't be any food at the event, you know, that's unfortunate that their access need won't be met, but it will allow them to pack food so that they can meet that need themselves. And sort of through presenting so we think about access plans and access guides as a way of communicating access, which sort of opened up this whole other conversation about how you can access communication. And in our small group, somebody was talking about sort of access for folks who have been labeled or who identify as intellectually disabled, and how for them, we might need to think about communicating through what's called plain language, or as you can see on the screen, pics, which are, and I've not done a good job at describing, but on the screen it says, what is a land acknowledgement? So land acknowledgements are often something we do in Canada, at least at the beginning of an event. We would recognize the Indigenous lands that we're occupying. But it's also important to explain that practice, to not just assume that everyone in the room has a shared understanding of what these things are. So this is taken from a page from a disability arts symposium. So even you can see the question, what is a symposium? So again, to try to sort of democratize the space by giving everyone access to the same kind of information, rather than assuming that people will sort of know what we mean by certain words. And there's also pictures which represent the concepts we're talking about. So that's an access guide, which can be really useful for I think, coming back to Mingus's notion of access intimacy, is sort of creating expectations so that people can sort of be in the space in the ways that they need to be. And also access riders is a new practice that I've just heard about out of the Unlimited Festival for Disability Arts out of London, the UK. They just released, and I can try to find the link for Yates, but instructions for disability artists to create their own access rider so that they can sort of attach these to artist contracts, which I think again is a really interesting way of sort of foregrounding what people need, all in the service of sort of creating the sort of intimate space. And another practice which I think can lead to creating the space. Oh, things wrong. That's great. Is obviously access check-in. So acknowledging that as sort of rigorously as you plan for access, and you can ask people to give feedback and to let you know what else they need on top of what you planned. It's also important to have an access check-in, as Yates did at the beginning of the talk, just to make sure that everyone's accessing the space in the way that they need to. The festival is called Unlimited. I'm sure, and hopefully somebody can provide a link to that. So approaching cultural accessibility through a critical access perspective, and trying to foster access intimacy or create the conditions for this to happen through a desire for disability, using an open access framework, gives us an opportunity to think about all of the ways that bodies and minds and arts come together, and all of the intersectional ways that we're often excluded from culture. And so in my practice, I'm trying to approach access with the commitment to intersubject relationality that begins with a commitment to making sure everyone feels good in the space. So in sort of the next half of my talk, I was going to try to think about how we can use access as a language and as a practice to disrupt some of the institutions we find ourselves in. But let's have a bit of a time check, because I know we're almost. So I wanted just sort of to conclude the first section of the talk was really sort of tried to emphasize that we need to approach disability, approach access through a not knowing stance. I did want to provide a few resources because I think, you know, it really, for me, is about this combination of planning for access and knowing access. Like there is value in knowing access and even approaching and developing a standard, but knowing that that's always going to be a standard that evolves as our understandings and experiences of access also evolve. So there are some resources on this slide, and maybe I could ask someone to post the links in the chat as well, or I can do it at the end. This is a Google Doc, and so there are instructions on how to contribute to this guide as well. But it's a pretty lengthy guide. It's a very lengthy guide, and it really goes through sort of all kinds of things, from the social model of disability to decolonizing disability, but also like how to hire an ASL interpreter, how to work with artists to create effective audio descriptions, sort of all of the practices, how to create an access guide. All of these things are linked there. And also the Bodies in Translation No Access Digital Catalog, I think is an interesting website, because each year from when we started this project, we ask people who we work with to write something about how how their understanding of access have changed in the last year. So it's sort of an interesting example of how, of sort of a palimpsest of how our understandings really are always in progress, always evolving. So that's that. So with that, I'll turn to the second part of my talk, which is shorter than the first. So it's called decolonizing access. So here on the screen, we see an image of Indigenous artist Vanessa Diane Fletcher, who's lying on her back on a low stage, and she's wearing a black coat and gold-colored leggings, and her hands are on her stomach. And then the next slide is a quote, which I'll read out. So I want to start this next section on decolonizing access with an Indigenous curator, Elwood Jimmy, and his recent thoughts on access. So the context for this quote is he's thinking about how access and decolonizing are related practices, which I think are really interesting. So in Canada, as much as there's an emphasis on sort of making our institutions more accessible, there's sort of a mirroring conversation about how we can decolonize our institutions, and that word in the Canadian context, I know decolonizing means lots of different things. It's thinking about working in solidarity with Indigenous people or the first people of this stolen land, to think about how we can work towards sort of promoting Indigenous ways of life, sovereignty, things like that. But as you can probably sort of guess from your own cultural context, both of these equity-seeking projects are often taken up within depoliticized ends. So for example, land acknowledgements are always given, always, right? And the Prime Minister of Canada might give a land acknowledgement, but that says nothing about his commitment to giving Indigenous people back their land, or even making sure that our Canadian understanding of universal healthcare extends to the Canadian North, where lots of Indigenous people live and don't have access to healthcare, or even things like clean water or schools or even hospitals. So you can imagine this contradiction of the pervasiveness of land acknowledgements that are not really followed by anything substantial. As sort of parallel to this sort of the symbolic wheelchair ramp that leads into a space where the thoughts and perspectives of disabled people are not encouraged or welcomed or attended to again lead to any real substantial change. So these are sort of parallel projects which sort of have begun to emerge but are not quite fully realized. So what Jimmy says, engagements and conversations about accessibility and disability mirror many of the problems we face when organizations attempt to include Indigenous and racialized bodies in modern colonial spaces. Efforts to decolonize and indigenize often address methodological and epistemological issues, so ways of doing and knowing, without really tackling ontological issues related to habits of being. So he says, unless we are prepared to be differently, to actually change what we're doing in space, rather than just knowing things differently or sort of talking about things differently, then then colonial habits of being remain unchallenged. And I'm going to skip a little bit just for the interest of time. So I was sort of encouraged and interested to hear about these thoughts by Jimmy. And I thought, they mirrored what I was reading in another book, which is called A Third University is Possible by Le Pepperon or Wayne Yang. And in this work, and I'd be happy to talk about it more in depth at a later date, but he presents to us this figure of the cyborg, and it's sort of a play on Donna Haraway's Cyborg, but it's spelled SCYBORGS. So I don't know how to pronounce that differently, but so a positioning of the cyborg are people who work within institutions as structural agents, so subversive beings with a decolonial desire. So he sort of says that within these colonial institutions, we can work from the inside through a decolonial desire to enact decolonial ways of being. And I was encouraged by that in combination with Jimmy's suggestion that efforts of decolonizing and efforts of access are related, because I was thinking, this means so much for me as somebody who is always questioning, where should I be working? Should I be working within the institution or outside of the institution? And I do work within universities, galleries, etc. I'm in these institutions that oppress people, and I'm inviting the disability community into these spaces. So how ethically can I extend that invitation? So I've started to think about, can access, can language and practices and ways of thinking about access help us to work as what Wang calls ghosts in the machine? So how can we sort of disrupt from the inside? So I'll conclude with a brief example, and then we'll go on to questions. So this is an image from an exhibition at Tangled Art called Hidden, curated by Gloria Swan. So on the image is a still from Keisha Williams' piece called An Altar to Our Ancestors. So we see 3 low plinths in white with blue cloths on top of them, and on top sit altars of flowers, spirits, plants, and small lights. So this exhibition was an extension of Gloria Swan's practice of using art to open up community conversations about Black mental health in response to an absence of spaces to talk about Black mental health or even access anti-racist mental health services. So in this exhibition, they draw on this concept of ableism given to us by Dustin P. Gibson, and I'll read part of the quote. Actually, I'll read all of the quote for access. So, Talia T.L. Lewis and Dustin Gibson write that ableism is a system that places values on people's bodies and minds based on socially constructed ideas of normalcy, intelligence, excellence, and productivity. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, colonialism, and capitalism. This form of system oppression leads to people and societies determining who is valuable and worthy based on people's appearances and their abilities to be satisfactorily reproductive, excel, and behave. So they conclude by saying you don't have to be disabled to experience ableism. So here's my example. So Gloria was talking about using this exhibition to talk about Black mental health and how a combination of racism and ableism prevents lots of Black disabled artists from participating in the art world. And as they were sort of planning for this exhibition, one of the artists selected wasn't able to attend the planning meetings and eventually wasn't able to produce a final piece of work. So rather than drop the artist, as some curators might do, I think Swan acted as this idea of a cyborg or an institutional activist, as Amanda Kachia talks about. So she held space for this artist within the show by having an empty plinth in the show and a statement over top, which described how neoliberal, capitalist, ableist, and racist systems all work together to prevent some artists, particularly Black disabled artists, from participating in culture. So instead of removing the artist from the exhibition altogether, this plinth held space for them. The artist was paid their artist fees, and they were featured as a contributor in the artist catalog, so they could reference his work in their CVs and things like this. So Swan provided access to this artist in a way that disrupted both neoliberal expectations of productivity and institutional expectations of what a complete exhibition would be. So Swan's capacity to provide the artist access, I think, was deepened by her commitments to breaking from colonial habits. Specifically, while working across many different institutions, galleries, arts funders, etc., her commitments to social justice were intervened by when she extended the circuitry meant to decolonize. So what I mean by that is she was able to provide the artist access by working within the system in sort of interventionist ways. So it was up to her to decide whether or not to pay the artist. So I think it's an interesting example of the capacity we have when we work within the institution to sort of make sure things play out differently. And to think about this as access means that we're sort of working with Dustin Gibson's concept of ableism. So access is a community address to ableism. And as Gibson tells us, ableism is linked to anti-Black systems to decide value based on our ability to produce. And so by thinking about and practicing access and the commitment to disability justice more broadly, I think Swan was acting as a ghost in the machine. She was sort of working in these ways that couldn't untangle the artist's experience of racism with how the artist experienced ableism as a Black disabled person. And so she mobilized accessibility and even the language of accessibility to disrupt the way that these systems oppress particular people. So I'm pretty excited about that, and to think about how we might be able to take up accessibility as political, as a case of sort of reworking these spaces so that different kinds of artists can find their way into them. So I think I'll end there. Just, yeah, I think that's a great place to end.